If you are captivated by these original Sherlock Holmes adventures, consider supporting us on Patreon. You will be rewarded with early access to our tales before they reach YouTube. Your monetary support truly makes these productions possible. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. It is a curious facet of human nature, I often reflect, that the very institutions erected to uphold the most rigid standards of honour are frequently assailed by those same base impulses they seek to exclude. Of all the social crimes capable of blighting a man's name in the refined echelons of Victorian society, few were as swift or as utterly devastating as an accusation of cheating at cards. In the rookeries of the East End, a man might lose his purse to a pickpocket and merely curse his ill luck. But in the velvet-lined card rooms of St. James's, a man accused of manipulating the pasteboards lost far more than mere coin. To be deemed a cheat was to be cast out, a social exile that meant the loss of wealth, position, and, far more devastatingly, one's standing among gentlemen. It was a brand that time itself could scarcely erase, clinging to a man's reputation like grave dust, ensuring that doors once thrown wide would be forever bolted against him. My memory retains with remarkable clarity the particulars of the Nonpareil Club scandal, a case which, for a brief and intense period, threatened to engulf one of the noblest names in the peerage. It was early June in the year 1894. London was sweltering under an unseasonable oppressive heatwave. The asphalt of the streets grew soft beneath the wheels of hansom cabs. The Thames exuded a sluggish, malodorous miasma, and the heavy air seemed to press down upon the city like a woolen blanket. Mr. Holmes had recently returned to his old haunts in Baker Street, emerging from that mysterious and harrowing interlude which had cast a pall over my spirits during his presumed demise at the Reichenbach Falls. Far from being exhausted by his travels through Tibet and Persia, his faculties seemed sharpened to an even finer edge, his deductive powers honed to a terrifying precision that bordered at times on the preternatural. The whispers began, as such toxic things often do, as faint, insidious murmurs circulating through the smoking rooms of Mayfair. They travelled from the leather armchairs of Boodles to the dining rooms of White's, before erupting into a veritable clamour that dominated the morning editions. The Nonpareil Club, an establishment of the most exclusive character where fortunes were quietly won and lost over claret and cigars, served as the crucible for this ruin. Membership to the Nonpareil was notoriously difficult to secure. It required the unanimous approval of a committee populated by dukes, earls and cabinet ministers. The accused in this sordid affair was His Grace, the Duke of Wellington, a man whose lineage stretched back to the Norman conquest. He was a statesman of minor renown, a philanthropist of major proportions, and a gentleman whose personal probity had hitherto been unquestioned. His estates covered vast tracts of Yorkshire, and his London residence was a palace in all but name. The accusation levelled against him was profoundly damning, striking at the very core of his aristocratic identity. The Duke had been caught marking cards at baccarat. I recall that stifling June morning well. The air in our sitting room was heavy, the windows thrown open to catch a non-existent breeze. Holmes sat opposite me in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, entirely oblivious to the heat, engrossed in a particularly lurid article from the Daily Chronicle. The summer sun slanted across his sharp, aquiline features, illuminating the intense focus in his piercing grey eyes. A half-smoked cigarette lay neglected in an ashtray, its smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. "Watson," he began, his voice a low, thoughtful drone that cut through the distant rumble of Baker Street traffic. "Have you ever considered the exquisite irony of a man, born to immense privilege, risking everything for the paltry gain of a few £100 at a card table?" I confessed the notion seemed absurd. I set aside my teacup and leaned forward. "One might expect such a desperate act from a man of straitened circumstances, Holmes. A half-pay officer, perhaps, or a younger son drowning in tailor's bills. A Duke of Wellington, however, has no need of such trickery. He could lose £10,000 in a night and scarcely feel the draft in his accounts." "Precisely, my dear fellow. The Duke's coffers overflow with generational wealth, and his influence is considerable. He possesses neither the motive of greed nor the desperation of debt. Yet, according to the clamour of the press and the furious whispers of polite society, he stands as a common sharper." He laid aside the newspaper, tapping the page with a long, nicotine-stained index finger. "The report here, though penned by a journalist given to melodramatic flourish, paints a vivid picture. A game of baccarat, stretching late into the night. Lord Ashworth, a notoriously punctilious man of somewhat rigid morals and declining fortune, serving as banker. The Duke enjoys an uncanny run of luck, calling the bank's hand with faultless precision. Suddenly, a flicker of suspicion arises from Ashworth, and minute, almost imperceptible markings are discovered upon the backs of several cards. The account declares these marks are visible solely under a particular angle of light. The scandal is immense. It threatens to unseat the Duke and simultaneously cast a shadow upon the very integrity of the Nonpareil Club. Surely, Holmes, if such markings were present, someone would have noticed them sooner. The cards are shuffled, dealt and handled by the croupier and the players alike. An excellent question, Watson, and one that cuts to the heart of the matter. The Chronicle chooses to leave that detail shrouded in the delectable mists of ambiguity, citing only the keen-eyed gentleman who spotted the anomaly. This matter is far from straightforward. The Duke has issued a vehement denial, claiming the affair is a grotesque misunderstanding or a deliberate slander. Alas, denials from the accused are often little more than the wind against a hurricane of public opinion. Society loves nothing more than to watch a titan fall. Holmes rose and began to pace the room with that restless feline energy that always preceded a deep intellectual exertion. For a scandal of this magnitude to spill into the public prints so swiftly suggests a deliberate campaign to discredit. Think of it, Watson. A duke brought low by so crude a stratagem as marked cards beggars belief. The methods of the common card sharp, the shiner concealed in a ring, the thumbnail indentation, the slight trimming of the card edges. These are the tools of the professional cheat, men who must ply their trade in shadowy gambling hells. We would expect a man of Wellington's standing to employ a far more sophisticated method, should he choose to stoop to villainy. There is a distinct odour of the unnatural about this affair. He paused by the mantelpiece, a glint entering his eyes. The markings, they say, were invisible until viewed under a specific light. That, my dear fellow, is the kernel of the puzzle. Invisible ink, lemon juice, milk, or basic sympathetic inks, is a crude device known to all schoolboys and easily detectable by its disruption of the card's surface gloss. A marking reliant upon specific luminous conditions, however, suggests a chemical reaction, or perhaps a complex manipulation of light itself. How would one investigate such a thing? I asked, feeling a familiar stir of excitement. The club will be a fortress of silence. The committee will have drawn the wagons in a circle to protect their own, and the Duke will be sequestered behind an army of solicitors. One does not batter down the front door of such an institution, Watson. One simply slips in through the cracks. The Nonpareil Club, for all its exclusivity, entertains guests provided they are introduced by a reputable member and conduct themselves with absolute decorum. A man of a certain age, with an air of continental refinement, a passion for the card table, and a suitably aristocratic title, might be permitted to observe where a prying investigator from Baker Street would be instantly repelled by the hall porter. A familiar thrill ran through me. Holmes was about to don one of his elaborate disguises, a practice in which he took immense, almost theatrical delight. "You mean to go in yourself?" I ventured. "Indeed. We cannot rely on the hearsay of journalists or the biased accounts of outraged lords. We need to observe the Duke in action, see these fabled markings for ourselves, and understand the precise optical and chemical mechanism of their revelation." Over the next 2 days, our rooms transformed from a comfortable bachelor sanctuary into a chaotic blend of theatrical wardrobe and chemical laboratory. Holmes chose the guise of an elderly Italian count, Count de Montebello. The backstory he wove was intricate. A minor Piedmontese nobleman, a widower with a sprawling but decaying villa near Turin, who travelled Europe indulging a lifelong passion for high-stakes baccarat. The physical transformation was nothing short of remarkable. His dark hair was dyed a snowy white, thinning artfully at the temples through the application of a caustic paste. A thick grey moustache and a small pointed beard, meticulously attached with spirit gum, altered the very structure of his jawline and cheekbones. His pale complexion acquired a sallow, sun-baked hue through the careful use of grease paint, and fine spider-web wrinkles were expertly drawn around his eyes and mouth. He acquired a set of wire-rimmed spectacles, padding for a slight arthritic stoop, and a heavy silver-topped cane. He practiced a rich, rolling Italian cadence endlessly, pacing the sitting room while gesturing expansively. "The essence of a disguise, Watson," he explained, peering at his reflection in the mirror over the fireplace, "is not merely the application of false hair and paint. It is to inhabit the very soul of the character. The Count is a man of the world, a cynic, a connoisseur of fine wines, and a devotee of the card table. His posture must reflect a life of leisure, tinged with the aches of old age. His gaze must be assessing, always calculating the odds." While the physical transformation took hours, he spent even more time at his makeshift laboratory bench. The smell of harsh acids and evaporating alcohol filled the flat. "The key lies in the optical properties of the room, Watson. I must be prepared for any eventuality." He produced a small, velvet-lined leather case containing several circular pieces of tinted glass. "These are specially filtered lenses, which I have coated with a thin layer of Canada balsam and infused with varying trace elements, selenium, cadmium, and cobalt. They are designed to isolate specific wavelengths of light. If our Duke is indeed marking cards, and if those markings are revealed under unusual luminous conditions, one of these little contrivances, slipped into a standard monocle frame, should prove most illuminating. Our entree was arranged through Sir Reginald Penhaligon, a former client with an insatiable appetite for gossip and a minor, albeit undisputed, membership at the Nonpareil. Flattered by the attention of the Count, and eager to show off his continental acquaintance, Sir Reginald happily agreed to host him for an evening of cards. On a remarkably balmy June evening, the heat having barely broken even as the sun set, I accompanied Holmes as far as the ornate wrought-iron gates of the club in St. James's. I watched with a mixture of anxiety and awe as the distinguished-looking Italian Count, leaning heavily on his cane and complaining loudly to Sir Reginald about the barbaric English humidity, disappeared into the gas-lit interior. I was instructed to wait at a discreet distance. I settled myself at a small coffee-house across the thoroughfare, keeping my eyes fixed upon the club's imposing portico. The hours dragged terribly. The night air was stifling, thick with the smell of horse manure and coal smoke. I drank several cups of bitter coffee, my imagination running riot with visions of Holmes being unmasked and thrown into the street by indignant aristocrats. It was well past 2 in the morning when Holmes finally emerged into the stifling summer night. The transformation in his demeanour was instantaneous the moment he cleared the club's steps. The arthritic stoop vanished. He was striding with purposeful, coiled energy. "To Baker Street, Watson, and quickly!" he commanded, leaping into a passing hansom before it had even fully stopped. "I have seen enough. The game is entirely clear to me. We have a solution that will confound the scoundrels who sought to ruin an innocent man." Back in our rooms, Holmes stripped off the false beard with a wince, poured himself a glass of claret, and lit his briar pipe. The thrill of the chase radiated from him. "A most illuminating evening, my dear doctor. The Nonpareil is precisely as you might imagine, hushed, suffocatingly opulent, and humming with the polite predatory tension of men gambling with fortunes. I found my way into a game of baccarat and intentionally lost a modest sum of £50 for the sake of verisimilitude. An unbroken winning streak draws unwanted attention. "And the Duke?" I pressed. The Duke of Wellington was there, seated at the high-stakes table, playing with a quiet, almost melancholic intensity. He is a man who seems to gamble not for the thrill of the win, but to temporarily silence the burdens of his station. He appeared to be winning consistently, though his bets were conservative. Lord Ashworth, his accuser, was also present. He was not playing, but hovering behind the Duke's chair, watching him with a peculiar mixture of triumph and bitter resentment. Holmes leaned forward, tapping his pipe against the grate. As the Duke dealt a hand, he was acting as banker. I brought my optical filters into play, pretending a momentary need to bring the cards into sharper focus due to the glare. The backs of the cards, Watson, were indeed marked. I detected an almost imperceptible sheen, a faint, iridescent glow, visible solely through my amber-tinted selenium lens. It was profoundly subtle, resembling a faint smudge of grease, yet undeniably present on the crucial face cards. "Good heavens, Holmes! Then the accusation was true. I exclaimed, my heart sinking at the thought of the Duke's ruin. To find guilt where one hoped for innocence is a bitter pill. Holmes smiled, shaking his head gently. The presence of markings proves only the existence of a foreign substance on the pasteboard. The nature of those markings, their origin, and the intent behind them remain to be determined. I shifted my focus from the cards to the Duke himself. I observed his habits at the table with the utmost scrutiny. He has a singular attachment to a very particular brand of Cuban cigar, the Puro de la Noche. Are you familiar with it, Watson? I cannot say that I am, I replied. They are a rare and exceedingly expensive import. Their tobacco leaves are grown in highly specific volcanic soil and undergo a unique, prolonged fermentation process in cedar barrels. This process leaves the wrapper leaves imbued with a subtle waxy residue, heavy with natural oils. It is highly prized by connoisseurs for its slow, even burn. Holmes produced his small silver cigar cutter and clipped the end of a discarded cigar stub he had evidently purloined from an ashtray at the club. He laid it gently on the table between us. Consider the sequence of events, Watson. The Duke plays cards and smokes heavily to steady his nerves. He holds his cigar between his index and middle fingers. As he turns his cards, a minute quantity of the chemical residue, the natural oils and waxes from his expensive cigar, transfers from his fingertips to the glossy surface of the card. But surely a grease smudge would be visible to the naked eye. In ambient, natural daylight, or under the soft glow of traditional oil lamps, this particular residue is effectively transparent. It blends perfectly with the gloss of the playing card. However, the Nonpareil Club recently underwent renovations. They updated the lighting over the high-stakes tables, installing the new, highly intense Welsbach gas mantles to cut through the heavy cigar smoke. Under the specific harsh spectrum of light emitted by these new mantles, this organic compound possesses a property of slight fluorescence. The faint, oily smear becomes discernible, but only if one is looking for it and only from a highly specific oblique angle where the glare catches the wax. He was marking them by accident. I breathed, the sheer elegance of the reality dawning on me. The Duke was completely unaware of the subtle chemistry he was performing. Precisely. He was guilty of nothing more than enjoying a fine cigar and resting his fingers on the cards. "And Lord Ashworth?" I asked, a sudden anger rising within me toward the Duke's accuser. "Ah, Ashworth. He is the true architect of this scandal." Ashworth knew of the Duke's particular smoking habits. They had been acquaintances for decades. He also recognized the peculiar optical properties of the new lighting in the card room, perhaps noticing a similar glare on a spilled drop of brandy or oil. I observed him tonight. He deliberately orchestrated the seating arrangements, insisting with feigned politeness that the Duke take the seat directly beneath the most intense gas mantle. Ashworth's discovery was not a moment of shocked realization. It was the execution of a meticulously planned trap. The motive? A long-standing, bitter grudge over a vast tract of hunting land in Yorkshire that the Duke legally acquired, but which Ashworth felt belonged to his family. Ashworth weaponized an innocent man's smoking habit to manufacture a scandal that would destroy his enemy's honor. The following afternoon, our Baker Street rooms hosted a profoundly tense assembly. Holmes had dispatched telegrams at dawn. Present were the Duke of Wellington, looking haggard and deeply distressed. his solicitor, Mr. Finch, a man of rigid nervous energy. Lord Ashworth, projecting an air of haughty indignation, and two senior members of the Nonpareil Club Committee, looking profoundly uncomfortable. Holmes wasted no time on pleasantries. The oppressive heat of the day only added to the suffocating tension in the room. He laid out his case with the absolute clarity of a mathematician, his voice cutting through the heavy air. He demonstrated, using a clean pack of Nonpareil club cards and a fresh Puro de la Noche cigar, exactly how the chemical deposits were transferred. He handled the cigar, dealt the cards, and then instructed the men to view the pasteboards through his amber lens, holding a bright gas lamp at the precise angle of the club's Welsbach mantles. Lord Ashworth scoffed initially, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. "This is parlour magic, Mr. Holmes, theatrical nonsense to protect a title cheat." "Look through the lens, my lord," Holmes commanded, his voice suddenly carrying the crack of a whip. Ashworth reluctantly stepped forward and peered through the glass. As he did, his sneer faltered, and a subtle pallor crept beneath his skin. The demonstration was irrefutable. The faint, ghostly sheen of the cigar oil became perfectly, undeniably visible to every man present. "The Duke," Holmes concluded, his gaze fixed icily upon Ashworth, "is a gentleman with a fondness for expensive cigars. His only fault is a habitual way of handling his cards. The marks were accidental, unavoidable, and entirely innocent." Lord Ashworth, however, recognized this optical phenomenon. He deliberately seated the Duke under the brightest lamp, waited for the oils to transfer, and maliciously presented a trick of light and chemistry as intentional, calculated cheating. A profound, stunned silence descended upon the sitting-room. The only sound was the distant clatter of a passing carriage. The Duke's solicitor exhaled slowly, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to mop his brow, the sheer force of his relief palpable in the stifling room. The Duke himself seemed to grow 2 inches taller, the crushing weight of the scandal lifting from his shoulders. Lord Ashworth, his face now a mottled, furious red, opened his mouth to speak, but found he had no argument against the undeniable scientific proof laying on the table before him. He turned on his heel and stormed from the room, the door slamming behind him. The truth was self-evident. The scandal dissolved with the quiet, swift dignity unique to the upper classes. The Duke of Wellington was fully and privately exonerated by the committee, his reputation restored without a word leaking further to the press, though he understandably cultivated a new habit of utilizing an ashtray during all future card games. Lord Ashworth, his malice exposed to the very men he sought to influence, was quietly asked to resign from the club. He retreated to his country estate in disgrace, a social pariah in the circles he had once inhabited. As for Holmes, once the lords and solicitors had departed, he merely stripped off his collar, poured himself a measure of water, and relit his pipe. "Another instance, Watson," he murmured, staring into the middle distance as the afternoon sun began to dip below the London rooftops, of the immense danger inherent in superficial observation. The obvious explanation that the man with the marked cards is a cheat frequently misleads. The world is full of details that appear straightforward, yet closer scrutiny often reveals a completely different, infinitely more complex reality. The most profound truths are frequently concealed within the most innocuous of habits. It is our task, my friend, not merely to see what is there, but to understand why it is there. He then turned his attention to a new chemical experiment involving the crystallization of copper sulfate, leaving me to write down the particulars of the case and to ponder the dark intricacies of manufactured criminality and the sublime intellect that could unravel such a tangled skein. Want to unlock the next story early? Do not forget to check out our Patreon using the link below.